Now available in paperback and Kindle Unlimited, E-Steam: The Sands of Time. It's action and adventure in ancient Egypt in this terrific teen time travel romance. Get your copy of E-Steam: The Sands of Time at your favorite online bookseller today. I was watching a world-class BSer's video last week where he talked about how Marvel and DC had sold over 250,000 trade paperbacks and graphic novels to liquidation and clearance stores like Ollie's and Five Below. And many comic fans don't understand the consequences of these two big publishers selling over 250,000 comic graphic novels and trade paperbacks to a liquidator or clearance store. But as a publishing professional with over 20 years in the business, I can tell you that when you see companies like Marvel and DC selling so many trade paperbacks and graphic novels to liquidation centers, it's a sign that the comic book industry is getting ready to collapse. Now, as a publishing professional, I know that there are three lists in the publishing industry at a publishing house. At a publishing house, there are three lists. There is the front list, which are the titles that a house is usually trying to push. These are the A books, like your X-Men's, your Superman's, your Batman's, and even some of the newer titles that have a bit of a following. So they're going to get the most attention from a publishing house, and they're going to get the most support and promotions, and they usually get the top creative teams. Then you have your mid-list books, which are usually the books that feature new characters or new concepts or untested and unproven writers and artists. And usually the mid-list books are the ones that the house usually expects to take huge losses on, but they're ones that they expect that might possibly do well if the audience catches them. And these are books like The Silencer and The Terrifics or Plastic Man. Those are your mid-list books because they have new fresh concepts, new fresh characters, or new fresh takes on a mid-card character. Now, the one list that is the most important to a publishing house is the backlist. And the backlist usually are books and stories that have already proven to be bestsellers. They have a continued and consistent following of readers over the years, and it's primarily reprinted material. And usually when you have a strong backlist, you can continue to make money if the front list and mid list titles don't sell. So when you have a company like Marvel and DC liquidating their graphic novels and trade paperbacks, that is a sign that this industry is getting ready to collapse. Because if you cannot sell your backlist titles, that means that you have no foundation to maintain your publishing house, because most publishing houses make a lot of their money, or most of their money, to cover the losses for many of the newer books on those backlist books. And if Marvel and DC cannot sell their backlist books at full price, that means that the industry is getting ready to collapse, because it was the trade paperbacks and the graphic novels that were keeping the industry afloat for so long, because so many people out there, they were out here looking for those backstories, and many older fans were looking for those old classic comics collected in those trade paperback formats, because it was a lot cheaper to buy the trade paperback of a book. And some comic fans, because they didn't want to buy the singles at $3.99, they found it cheaper to buy comics when they would come to trade, because you would hear many comic fans saying they would wait for trade. But if you have these comic fans not buying any comics in trade format, that shows again that the industry is getting ready to really start collapsing. Because if you don't have a backlist, then you don't have readers going back looking for materials. It's like I said in a previous video, that it's the front list books that sell the backlist titles, and it's the backlist titles that sell the front list titles. It's an interdependent relationship as related to all three of the lists. Because if I, for example, if I publish one ISIS series story and it becomes very popular, that person who has read that book that just came out will then start searching for the backstories of the character. And that's why it's important for a writer to continue to consistently write solid stories, because readers go from back to front or front to back on serialized stories. However, over the last 20 years, it has become incredibly difficult for people to do that type of research on comic titles due to the constant rebooting at companies like Marvel and DC. And with there being reboots at Marvel almost every year and at DC at every 3 to 5 years, people have not had incentive to go out here and buy trade paperbacks, because the comic they're holding in their hand does not relate to the backstory of those back issues. And the only people who have incentive to buy back issues are the people who knew the current continuity. For example, when DC decided to launch the New 52, people who read classic DC had no incentive to buy any of the trades as related to the New 52, the Convergence, or the Rebirth. They only bought classic stories. So what they did when they rebooted the universe was they fragmented the universe, and they also fragmented the audience. So instead of you having one consistent group of fans going out to buy all of the back graphic novels and trade paperbacks and even the back issues, you have 3 or 4 audiences, because this universe is so fragmented and in so many pieces that no one can really follow it in a consistent manner. And the damage is even more extensive at Marvel, where we had all of these events ever since the Heroes Reborn and Heroes Return in the 90s, followed by the New Avengers, followed by the Marvel Now, and then what many people call SJW Marvel with the Forced Diversity, and the Secret Wars, and all of these different events where you have these reboots of a new #1 almost every year or every 2 years, so that when these books come to trade, people just cannot go back and go look for more titles featuring that character, because the continuity has become so confusing. And because everything is so confusing, so many people who used to be comic fans just don't know when to start or where to start as related to the big two. And that's why it's almost impossible to sell trade paperbacks. Now, this is compounded by things like the Marvel Cinematic Universe and the DC Cinematic Universe, where they take elements of the comic stories, but they are all their own separate worlds. And the people and the kids who grew up with the Marvel and DC Cinematic Universe, they have not gone to the comic stores to go seek out these characters' backstories, because the backstory that they were shown is nothing like the comics. For example, with Spider-Man Homecoming, we saw the complete omission of Peter Parker's origin, no mentions of Uncle Ben, and Aunt May looks nothing like Aunt May in the comics, and Peter Parker's relationship with Tony Stark is the main focus of the story. So if a kid goes to a comic store looking for a Spider-Man comic, he's going to find a completely different story than the one that was featured in the movie. And when it relates to movies like your DC's movies, they don't, again, see the characters that were in the comics on from the TV screen. So that's the other reason why all of these book graphic novels are just selling poorly, because people just don't connect the characters with the story. Now, the other thing that was messing up Marvel was that forced diversity initiative that was going on just as the MCU was going on, and people were not seeing Tony Stark Iron Man, they weren't seeing Peter Parker Spider-Man, they weren't seeing Steve Rogers Captain America, they weren't seeing the heroes that they saw in the movies on screen. They were seeing all these characters, and again, that wound up destroying sales of these books in venues like the comic shop, like Barnes & Noble, and like Amazon, because that's the main reason why we have over 250,000 of these books being sold to liquidators, is because those big retailers could not sell those books at full price. So now they are deeply discounting them and selling them to these liquidators in the hopes of getting some sort of profit just on the print cost, because that's why you can get this book for $5, is because they're paying just for the printing cost on this reprint, because this reprint was supposed to be profit for the company. The $34 price tag, all that was supposed to be gravy for the publisher on some already previously printed material, because that's what the backlist usually is for a publisher. It's all gravy. It's all money in the bank for them. And with the money in the bank now being put in jeopardy for publishing houses like Marvel and DC, what that's saying is that this industry is in dire straits right now, because if you cannot sell reprint material in a publishing industry, that means you as a publisher are on the brink of going out of business. Because again, there are 3 lists in the publishing industry, and the backlist is considered to be the most profitable because those books have already paid out their printing cost. And if these books cannot continue to make money for a publishing house and they have to liquidate these books, that means that the industry is in trouble. Because if you cannot sell your back books, you are not going to be able to sell your front books. And this is where the industry is winding up in these dire straits right now. But people like your Dan Didos, your CB Sobalskis, your Sana Amanats, they just don't understand the crisis that's getting ready to come to the Marvel and DC publishing houses, and how that's going to impact the overall comic book industry. When I see that's going on right now with this 250,000 trade paperbacks being liquidated, is the start of the collapse of the comic book industry. And this collapse is going to be worse than what people experienced in the 1950s. Because back in the 1950s, when Dr. Frederick Wertham came out with Seduction of the Innocent, it led to the closing of numerous publishing houses, which led to many comic writers and artists being out of a job, many people losing their livelihoods, and some sadly turning to drugs and alcohol because they had no way to make a living, and they saw the industry they love fall completely apart. And that's all due to the mismanagement of the comic book industry over the last 25 years, because we have not had a publishing professional in charge to lead this industry or to take it in a direction where it could go in the 21st century. And what's the saddest thing about this start of the collapse of the comic book industry is that this was preventable. Unfortunately, most people in the industry did not want to bring in a new visionary to try to rebuild this industry or to try to take it in a new direction, because most people were just believing that they could do the exact same things from the 1990s and expect a different result, not understanding that's the definition of insanity, because the approaches from the 1990s and the business models from the 1990s didn't work in the 1990s. All that led to was Marvel going bankrupt, and all it's leading to now is Marvel and DC getting ready to return to bankruptcy once again. Because again, if you cannot sell your backlist books to new readers, then they have no interest in buying your front list books, because it's the book that people are holding in their hands that gives them an incentive to either go out and seek out the new stories featuring the character, or go back and seek out the stories featuring the old stories featuring the character. And if casual people aren't picking up things like trade paperbacks or graphic novels, that's a sign that the industry is not only in decline, it's going to collapse. And that collapse, sadly, is coming sooner rather than later. If you'd like to pick up some of my SJS Direct publications, like the ISIS series, the Eastine series, the Temptation of John Haynes, the John Haynes series, and the Spinsterella trilogy, you may do so by clicking the link to Amazon.com in the description box. And if you want to help me make more videos like this and pay for book covers for upcoming ISIS, Eastine, and John Haynes series books, you may do so by clicking the link to my Patreon in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.